In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the new religious tradition of Wicca, which, as I mentioned in the lecture, is part of the larger neo-pagan movement, which are a grouping of new religions that are focused on they're earth-centered, as they would put it. And Wicca is a very interesting case, and we actually offer a course at our LCT in new religious movements and cults taught by Dr. Adrian Langdon. So if you're interested in the larger phenomenon of new religious movements, you could take that course. But for our purposes today, I want to focus on Wicca and particularly how it relates to ritual, which is the topic of our course, and to gender. And so we see with this image I've chosen, it's the moon in its different phases. And this tells us right away, the moon is a very ubiquitous symbol used in Wicca. And so the idea of the moon with its traditional associations with the cycles of the ocean, also with women, with irrationality, with sort of the more poetic, intuitive realms. So the moon is a very common symbol. Also within Wicca, often you'll hear them say it's associated with the timelines in a woman's life. So maiden, mother, crone. So as a woman moves through her biography, she moves into these different stages of life as maiden, mother, and then crone. Another very important aspect of Wicca is the desire to see the divine represented as female, in a female form. Now, many of you will know that that does exist in other religious traditions, such as Hinduism, but in the Abrahamic traditions, other than the figure of the Virgin Mary, it's largely divine, the divine as male. And so with a lot of these new religious movements, as I mentioned in the lecture, many of them were led by women, and so there was increasingly the desire to see the divine represented as female. And so I've given you an example here. This is actually a statuette that was unearthed. It's from the Neolithic period, and archaeological evidence is revealing that probably worship of the feminine divine is one of the oldest forms of worship there is. And so we don't overdo it. We don't really know what this means when you find something like this that's so ancient. But we think our best guess is that this is some kind of a fertility goddess. And so the pagans and the Wiccans have taken this up as a symbol. And so I find this really fascinating. If you go into New Age bookstores or shops that cater to the Wiccan or neo-pagan community, you'll often find reproductions of this statuette. And so it's also reclaiming this idea of a tradition that existed before Judaism, before Christianity, and before Islam. Here you can see an image of Starhawk, who is probably the single most influential person within the Wiccan movement. Starhawk was born Jewish and was a member of the larger counterculture of the 1960s. She was involved in protests against the Vietnam War and became an environmental activist and is still a political and environmental activist to this day. I've actually met Starhawk. I interviewed her and I went to a number of her talks. She's a fascinating person. And if you look closely, she's wearing the figure of the goddess on a chain around her neck. So Starhawk's a perfect example of the women that I'm talking about, that merges in a way from the lineage of the new women who want to see a feminine face of the divine. And so Starhawk, building on people who had gone before her like Gardner, and through her own creativity, she develops a whole series of writings and rituals that are now used by Wiccans. So here we have the cover image of the Spiral Dance, which is also probably one of the most, if not the most, influential books within the Wiccan movement. And this was written by Starhawk in 1979. And if you look below the title, it says a rebirth of the ancient religion of the great goddess. So that's telling us there a great deal, just in the title, that Wiccans often hark back to this ancient religion that existed in pagan times or before the Abrahamic traditions, and also to a tradition that focuses on the goddess and on the female face of the divine. So I'd rather hear from Starhawk herself rather than paraphrase her regarding what her religion is. So let's just look at this. Witchcraft is a word that frightens many people and confuses many others. In the popular imagination, witches are ugly old hags riding broomsticks or evil Satanists performing obscene rites. Modern witches are thought to be members of a kooky cult primarily concerned with cursing enemies by jabbing wax images with pins and lacking the depth, the dignity, and seriousness of purpose of a true religion. So here we can see Starhawk is making an argument for witchcraft and Wicca as a form of religion and not, as she calls it, a kooky cult. And she's definitely separating Wicca out from Satanism, which is often confusing for, I think, the average person. I say that because I taught this course years ago. It's a bit more known now, but when I taught it years ago in Winnipeg, the minute I used the word, I saw a bunch of people crossing their arms. So there's definitely ideas about what this means in the popular imagination. Now, it's important to note the Wiccans, especially Starhawk, have used the word witch very playfully and ironically. So they know very well that it's a charged word and they use it often sarcastically. But here she's making the argument that, in fact, Wicca is an actual legitimate religion. So she says, but witchcraft is a religion, perhaps the oldest religion extant in the West. Its origins go back before Christianity, Judaism, Islam, before Buddhism and Hinduism as well, and it is very different from all the so-called great religions. So she's making a claim for authenticity and for age for Wicca. Now, this is very controversial. I'm not going to get into it. I've been to conferences where this causes a lot of rancor, but I don't think it's important for our purposes today, other than to know that this is what many Wiccans claim. And also, they're making a larger point here that they're trying to get back to earth-based traditions. Now here we have another excerpt from the Spiral Dance, and Starhawk goes on to say, the old religion, as we call it, is closer in spirit to Native American traditions or to shamanism of the Arctic. It is not based on dogma or a set of beliefs, nor on scriptures or a sacred book revealed by a great man. Witchcraft takes its teachings from nature and reads inspiration in the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, the flight of the birds, the slow growth of the trees, and the cycles of the seasons. So I think this is fairly self-explanatory, but I just would add that we see a definite dovetailing with the environmental movement, and many, many people who are involved in Wicca are also involved in the environmental movement. So here we have what's called the Wheel of the Year, and these practices, these festivals are called sabbats. And so the Wiccans, again, you can't make a statement about all Wiccans because there's no centralized authority, but this is a typical series of rituals and festivals that have been developed by pagans, and each group will change it slightly, but they often will base their practices and rituals on the work of Starhawk and other well-known Wiccans. And so again, this idea that the rituals, a lot of them are also based on the phases of the moon, that there's the idea that we're trying to tie ourselves back to the natural world. And here we have it, the actual spiral dance. So I believe this is Reclaiming, which is probably the largest Wiccan group in the world that I know of anyway, that's based out of California and is Starhawk's group. And so you'll immediately notice this is mostly women. So that is telling that it's generally women when we're looking at Wicca, although there are men in the movement. And so we see here that they're enacting the spiral dance, and the idea of the community of women, the mutual support of women are definitely ideas coming out of the larger feminist movement. And also I've come across cases, and I know this anecdotally also, of Wiccans who have developed rituals around things like girls' puberty. So as we saw in the Hindu tradition, they've tried to develop kind of Wiccan-style rituals around the different phases of a woman's life. So again, along with that feminine face of the divine, also tailoring rituals specifically to the way that women live their lives and experience the world. Now, I've been saying again and again in this course to pay attention to clothing. I think in our culture it's something that we don't take very seriously, but in fact, what we wear is signaling something to other people all the time, unless you're in your home alone, which some of us have been in the pandemic, but generally you're also signaling something to the world about your age, your job, and so on, your status, etc. And so if we were in person, I'd have us examining this together, but we're not, so I'll just do it myself. So you can see right off the bat that this is not an outfit that this young woman would have bought at, Old Navy. So this is clearly, if not a custom-made garment, it's from some kind of a shop that's very unusual. So the style is clearly sort of gesturing towards the medieval period. It's made out of what looks like velvet. So in this garment, we can see this whole occult movement, the influence of the arts and crafts movement, this desire to hark back to another time before modernity. So even just with this one simple garment, this young woman it holds a whole host of symbolisms about the way she sees the world and herself. Okay, well, this is a more punk take on Wicca, but nonetheless, if we sort of deconstruct this outfit and her hair and the way she's just her overall appearance, we can see that again, this is the idea of something unusual, that this is clearly not somebody who's trying to fit in with general fashion. And so it wants to stand out in a certain way. And I would argue, along with the other outfit, that clothes in this way are used by Wiccans to re-enchant modernity. I talk about that in the lecture, that idea of the way that modernity, clothing is mass-produced, furniture is mass-produced, everything looks the same. You can go to Singapore and see Starbucks. It's all very dispiriting. So this idea that the individual or groups of individuals can begin to enchant their own lives by, for instance, taking up, I know there's a lot of jokes about this, but I completely get it, and I'm kind of part of this, I would say, wanting to find handmade things, wanting to find artisanal things. And so some of you may have gone to the farm in North Bay. I love that store. So that idea of, buying things that are crafted by local people, this is very typical of these people that are part of these movements. So here we have a pagan altar. We've talked about altars and sacred space in this class already, and so you won't be surprised that a pagan altar symbolizes and represents the pagan view of the world, the way that that young woman's Catholic altar symbolized her view of the world and the meaning within her own life. And so this altar, a pagan altar can look any way the person wants, but this one is using the symbols of the elements. So again, tying ritual back to nature. Lots and lots of candles. That's very typical, probably of, I guess, all religious traditions. And so the idea of having a personal altar is it's very common practice within the Wiccan community. So in this image, we can see the many, many candles. And I mean, just to look at that for a moment, the idea of candlelight, right? That it's not so industrial, like that terrible fluorescent light we find in many institutional settings. It's a soft light, lends itself to ambience. And so we also see here a Ouija board and a tarot deck. And so I talk about this in the lectures, that the larger occult movement brought these, and the spiritualist movement brought these more and more into, if not the mainstream, they're certainly pretty well known now. And so it's very typical, not necessarily so much Ouija boards, but certainly tarot cards are very, very common for Wiccan people to possess and to use frequently. So this idea of using divination and these more irrational, less mechanistic ways of looking at the world is again typical of Wicca. So I talk in the lecture about Gardner and the Book of Shadows, and so just the title's so great. And really, you're probably already making connections to things like Harry Potter and so on. They're all very much, I would say, the product of that larger occult movement and interest in those types of things. And so Another common practice in Wicca is to keep a book of shadows. Sometimes it's called a grimoire. And so you keep your spells in there, often handwritten. And so even again, if we look at the book itself, you can see the pentacle, you can see the beautiful craftsmanship of the leather. So the idea of having items in your home, this is very William Morris, things that are beautiful, things that are useful, so that each item is kind of enchanted. It's not just some crummy notebook from Shoppers Drug Mart. It holds meaning for the. So here we have a spell. This one's very elaborate, and it's done like an illuminated manuscript from the medieval period. So again, harkening back to the medieval period, when it's interesting to look at that, when because it was usually pages from the Bible, so they'd be beautifully highlighted. If any of you ever go to Ireland, it's called the Book of Kells, or you can see images online. Each letter is done perfectly and by monks. And so there's kind of an imitation of that going on here. And I can't spend too much time on spells, and I think this can be a little bit controversial. It was interesting to me in the 90s, early 2000s, you would come across books of spells in, indigo, which was strange for me. But partly this was coming out of popular culture, out of shows like Charmed and other TV programs. And so every second 15-year-old, and it was typically a girl, would have these books of spells. And so there's all sorts of speculations around why that became popular. Some people argued that it gives adolescents a sense of control at a time in their life when they don't have a lot of control. I would also say that spells are not unlike mantras or other forms of prayer. I don't think it's all that different, really. So I definitely think this is also part of that desire to bring spirituality back into life. I just wanted to finish with just looking very quickly at the political implications of Wicca, and those were there right from the beginning, as we saw with Starhawk. This was never, often new religious movements are accused of being a withdrawal from society, a retreat into fantasy, and so on. And we can see that already in Wicca, there is that element of fantasy, and I would argue that doesn't mean that you reject reality. I would argue that, as Weber said, human beings need fantasy, they need to enchant the reality. That's just how human beings roll. But anyway, that's an argument for another time. But certainly Wicca, many Wiccans have been politically active, as I already said, in the environmental movement and in the feminist movement. And so here we have one of the, I love this picture, one of the first groups in the 60s who used the acronym WITCH. Again, using that word and reclaiming that word, which is usually something hurled at women in a very insulting way, hag, witch, so on, and reclaiming it as a word of power. And so, and with a lot of humor and playfulness, and this remains a very important aspect of Wicca. So here we have a picture of a number of contemporary witches. I believe this picture was taken in Australia, and this is part of the larger Me Too movement. And so you can see from the signs what they're all about. Equality is magic, not charmed by sexism, mad about misogyny, will put a spell on patriarchy. Very funny, very cute. So, and the way they're dressed, they're looking like they're having a great time here, but they're making a very serious point. And so we can see that people are continuing to use that imagery of the witch as an idea of female empowerment. And reclaiming the idea of magic and spells and so on in a way that's empowering for women.